Picture this. The camera glides over turquoise water so clear it looks photoshopped, then sweeps toward two islands lounging at the southern edge of the Caribbean like they're minding their own business. Before anyone called them Trinidad and Tobago, the first peoples knew them as Ier, sometimes rendered Land of the Hummingbird, and Tavaco or Tobacco, likely tied to the region's word for tobacco. Yes, the plant Columbus would later pretend he discovered. Classic. We're in the southernmost Caribbean, just off the coast of Venezuela. The islands sit at the crossroads of the Lesser Antilles, the continental shelf, and several migration routes older than every flag ever raised here. From the bamboo groves to the mangrove-lined coves, everything looks peaceful. Which is exactly how every Caribbean documentary starts, right before somebody's empire shows up uninvited. Cut to 1498. Columbus scribbling in his logbook about discovering an island already containing an established Kalinago and Arawak population with trade networks, agriculture, and cosmology. The man basically walked into a crowded house party and announced, "I found this empty place." Spoiler, it wasn't empty, and the people inside were not impressed. On a ridge near the northern range, the camera lingers. Those hills sheltered communities, rebellions, plantations, and politics. In 1637, a Spanish report complained that indigenous groups kept slipping away into these forests beyond control. Translation: resistance was here from day one. Tourists see beaches. Those mountains? They've seen some things. Before any empire mistook the Caribbean for a gold-filled vending machine, Trinidad and Tobago were already busy. Archaeology from places like WWII Trace, one of the oldest human sites in the Caribbean, tells us people had been here for 7,000 years or more by the time European ships arrived. Farming, fishing, weaving, paddling massive canoes like regional express buses connecting the islands to the Orinoco Delta and beyond. The Arawak communities, related to Locano and Taino peoples, cultivated cassava, maize, and sweet potato in organized plots that fed hundreds. Meanwhile, Kalinago communities specialized in maritime skill and defense, their reputation for protecting territory spreading across the island chain. Picture flexible villages built near rivers, shell tools sharp enough for butchering fish, carved wooden stools, cotton hammocks. Yes, cotton hammocks. The innovation that colonizers would later try to patent like they invented sleep. Ecosystems weren't scenery, they were survival technology. The Nareva swamp functioned as a supermarket, offering fish, crabs, medicinal plants, and fresh water. The northern range provided a fortress, its dense forests and steep trails impossible to navigate without local knowledge. Tobago's reefs sustained fisheries with management rules long before sustainability became a grant proposal buzzword. When Spanish chroniclers finally showed up in the early 1500s, they described communities swift in canoe and fierce in defense. Later, in the 1620s, a Kalinago leader named Hayarima of Arima would become famous for resisting Spanish authority, rallying groups across the northern hills and refusing to submit to mission towns. But his defiance was rooted in centuries of people protecting their homelands. Long before any European drew a map, they didn't just live here, they curated a world. And then empires arrived, convinced they could improve on 7,000 years of experience. Columbus sailed into the Gulf of Paria in July 1498, gazed at Trinidad's hills through humid morning light, and immediately did what Europeans loved doing in the 15th century. Declared things he named the island for the Holy Trinity, which feels ironic given that his crew immediately began violating most Christian moral principles on contact. His journal describes seeing many people along the shoreline, canoes approaching the ships, curious but cautious. But don't worry. That didn't stop him from claiming discovery rights like a guy tagging a parking spot someone's already using the Spanish crown. Thrilled at the idea of new territorial claims, but disappointed by the lack of gold, issued orders for pacification, which in 16th century empire speak meant Step 1, demand labor. Step 2, act confused when people resist. Step 3, record resistance as hostility. And resist they did. Indigenous communities withdrew into the interior, sabotaged Spanish attempts at settlement, and defended their trading routes with a combination of strategic retreat and targeted confrontation. A 1508 report sent back to Spain complained that the island was unprofitable due to the unwillingness of the natives to submit to labor. Translation: they refused to build their own oppression. The Spanish tried establishing missions and encomiendas, but Trinidad's dense forests and the indigenous population's refusal to cooperate turned colonization into a slow, frustrating crawl. By the 1530s, Spanish settlers were writing home about attacks on small outposts, disappearing cattle, and the maddening reality that the people they wanted to control kept vanishing into mountains that seemed to swallow footprints. The Spanish wanted submission. What they got was evasion, sabotage, and a stubborn insistence that Air belonged to the people who'd been managing it for millennia. The first clash wasn't just about land. It was about worldview, about whose understanding of territory, labor, and belonging would define the future. Spoiler: the people with gunpowder won the battles, but they never quite won the land. As Spanish settlers attempted to formalize encomiendas across Trinidad in the mid-1500s, a system allegedly about protection, but actually unpaid forced labor backed by violence, indigenous populations plummeted due to warfare, European diseases, and displacement. The Spanish wrote constantly about reducing populations to mission towns, basically trying to restructure entire societies around colonial convenience and Catholic conversion. But Trinidad wasn't profitable enough to attract large Spanish migration, so the colony limped along, underpopulated and overambitious. By the late 1500s, desperate for labor and unable to coerce enough indigenous workers, settlers began importing enslaved Africans to fill the gap. The earliest records are sparse, many names absent, and archival silence louder than any proclamation. Some fled immediately into the forest, joining remnants of indigenous communities still resisting Spanish control. Others stayed on the struggling estates, resisting through work slowdowns, tool sabotage, or outright revolt when the moment allowed. Spanish Governor Don Domingo de Vera y Orue, tasked with stabilizing the colony in the 1590s, wrote with barely concealed frustration that the island was difficult to control for want of loyal labor. The audacity, blaming the people you're trying to enslave for not participating enthusiastically in their own exploitation. These early African communities, small but determined, created cultural blends that shaped Trinidad's Creole foundations long before sugar plantations took over. They learned indigenous trails, adapted agricultural techniques, and built survival networks in the island's interior. Meanwhile, Spain's attention drifted toward richer colonies in Mexico and Peru, leaving Trinidad as an afterthought, a neglected corner of empire where control was more theoretical than actual. People survived by adapting, resisting, disappearing into the hills, choosing life over obedience. Year after exhausting year, the mountains quietly filled with those the archives forgot to name, but whose descendants would reshape everything. By the early 1600s, Spain had a Trinidad problem. Not enough settlers, not enough cash, and way too much indigenous and African resistance for their colonial comfort. So while they technically owned the island on European maps, they barely controlled it. Think absentee landlord, but with muskets and unfulfilled promises. To fix the population crisis, governors like Martín de Salvatierra encouraged Catholic immigrants, mostly from the Canary Islands. But it wasn't enough. Small plantations struggled along using enslaved African labor, producing cocoa and tobacco in quantities that disappointed investors back in Tobago. By contrast, was about to become a tug-of-war between every European empire with a naval budget and a sugar habit. Then came 1783. Spain issued the Cedula of Population, an immigration policy basically saying, "Please come settle this island. Bring your families, your enslaved labor force, and your ability to produce sugar also. Be Catholic-ish." Cue French planters fleeing revolutionary upheaval in Martinique, Grenada, and Guadeloupe. They arrived with enslaved Africans, agricultural knowledge refined across decades of Caribbean plantation management, and a highly developed sense of entitlement, the colonial starter pack. Between 1783 and 1797, Trinidad's enslaved population exploded from around 300 to over 10,000. Sugar estates developed rapidly across the Caroni Plains and Naparaima region, clearing forests and building the infrastructure of industrial agriculture, mills, boiling houses, barracks. As usual, life on these estates meant pre-dawn wake-ups, cane cutting under tropical heat, exhaustion, punishment for perceived slowness, and survival strategies ranging from subtle sabotage to outright flight. Maroon communities continued forming in the island's dense interior, particularly in the northern range, where Spanish-era fugitives had established trails and hideouts. These early Maroons don't get enough attention in Trinidadian history textbooks, but they were there. Small groups living beyond plantation society's reach. Refusing to let sugar swallow the entire landscape, sugar didn't build Trinidad. Enslaved Africans did. Sugar just took the credit and the profits. In February 1797, British Admiral Ralph Abercrombie sailed into Trinidad with 18 warships, spotted the underdefended Spanish garrison at Port of Spain, and did what Britain always did in the Caribbean. Politely suggested surrender while aiming enough cannons at the town to guarantee compliance. The Spanish governor, Don José María Chacón, assessed his options, a few hundred soldiers versus Britain's naval power, and accepted. Trinidad became British without a war, a colonial bargain sale facilitated by Spain's distraction with European conflicts. Enter Thomas Picton, Britain's first governor, a man known for two things: turning Trinidad into a plantation cash machine and being charged in London for the torture of a 14-year-old free girl of color named Luisa Calderon. Picton's rule from 1797 to 1803 was essentially maximize profit, minimize mercy, ignore legal niceties. Plantation records explode during this period. Sugar, cocoa, and coffee estates multiplying like invasive species across fertile plains, each one a small kingdom of coerced labor and calculated violence. Enslaved Africans endured brutal schedules. Up before dawn, cane cutting through midday heat, milling, boiling, field clearing, and maintenance tasks that stretched past sunset. Mortality rates soared. Medical care was non-existent or punitive. Runaways took to the forests of the northern range, following paths established by earlier Maroons, forming small but steady communities beyond plantation borders. Meanwhile, British estate owners wrote home complaining about idleness and insolence, which is 19th century code for people resisted dehumanization in every way they could. Some sabotaged mills by introducing stones into the grinding mechanism. Others feigned illness, negotiated through work slowdowns, or whispered revolutionary ideas inspired by Haiti, where enslaved people had successfully overturned colonial rule just years before. Picton eventually faced trial in London for torturing Calderon, though he escaped serious consequences because British law protected men like him better than it protected children like her. The British brought new flags, new laws, and the same old plantation violence, just with better record-keeping. The British Parliament passed the Abolition Act in 1833, ending slavery across the empire starting August 1st, 1834. Cue celebrations across Trinidad and Tobago, and then immediate disappointment, because Britain decided formerly enslaved people needed to apprentice for their freedom. Apprenticeship was basically slavery with a slower internet connection. Same labor, same masters, same punishments, but now it came with paperwork and the pretense of legality. People were required to work 40 hours a week without pay for the various states that had profited from their enslavement, supposedly learning skills they'd been performing expertly for decades. British abolitionist John Scobell, after reviewing Caribbean reports in 1837, called apprenticeship a cruel mockery of freedom. In Trinidad and Tobago, formerly enslaved Africans walked off estates, protested at magistrate courts, and filed formal complaints demanding wages and humane treatment. Estate owners panicked because without coerced labor, sugar profits wilted faster than cut cane in the tropical sun. Production declined. Investors complained. London received anxious letters warning that the entire Caribbean economy might collapse if workers gained actual autonomy. Under mounting pressure from abolitionists and the apprentices themselves, Britain ended the system early on August 1, 1838, turning emancipation into an actual emancipation. Formerly enslaved people left plantations in droves, seeking land, establishing villages, building churches, and reconstructing families torn apart by decades of sale and separation. Planters, now deprived of free labor and facing a workforce with options, panicked again, this time writing to London with an all-caps energy. "We need workers." Their solution? Import laborers from everywhere except their own class. India, China, Madeira, West Africa. The plantation machine wasn't dismantled. It just upgraded to a new operating system, one that ran on indentureship contracts instead of ownership papers. Freedom arrived for African-descended people in Trinidad and Tobago. But equality, land reform, and reparations didn't hitch a ride. On May 30, 1845, the ship Fatel Razak arrived in the Gulf of Paria carrying the first group of Indian indentured laborers, 225 individuals, mostly Bhojpuri and Awadhi-speaking villagers from North India. Many fleeing famine, debt, or British colonial recruitment pressure disguised as opportunity. They stepped onto Trinidadian soil wearing cotton garments more suited to North India's climate than Coroni's sticky heat, clutching small bundles containing everything they owned. They would adapt, just like the Africans before them, just like the indigenous peoples before anyone. Indentureship contracts were technically voluntary, but let's be honest, when your other option is starvation under British economic policy in India, voluntary becomes flexible. Indians were contracted for 5 years, paid minimal wages that often arrived late or incomplete, and tightly policed on estates through fines, restrictions, and threats of criminal prosecution for contract violations. British Governor Lord Harris cheerfully wrote in 1848 that Trinidad was a colony without a history, which is historian code for "I have not read anything, and also I'm dismissing millennia of indigenous presence and centuries of African resistance." Indentured workers planted cane, weeded endless rows, cut timber, and faced fines for everything from lateness to insolence. Estate diaries complain about breaches of discipline, meaning people resisted. Workers negotiated contracts when they could, demanded medical care, and filed complaints in colonial courts. Sometimes winning, more often losing, but always insisting on their humanity within a system designed to extract labor while denying dignity. Africans and Indians interacted cautiously at first, separated by plantation strategy, language barriers, and different religious calendars. But in markets, estate barracks, and during festivals, cultures began weaving into Trinidad's expanding Creole landscape. Indentureship was not slavery, but it was not freedom either, just a new chapter in plantation capitalism's evolving playbook, a system that learned to exploit without owning, to control without chains. Tobago deserves its own documentary for the sheer number of times Europe swapped ownership like it was a collectible trading card. Between the 1600s and 1800s, Tobago flipped between Dutch, Coronian. Yes, Latvia tried colonizing the Caribbean, British and French control, sometimes twice in one decade. Treaties signed in European capitals determined Tobago's fate while Tobagonians watched empires arrive, build plantations, collapse economically, and sail away, leaving debt and exhausted soil. By the mid-1800s, Britain held Tobago firmly, but struggled to maintain its sugar economy after emancipation. Unlike Trinidad's flat plains, Tobago had steep hills, fragile soils prone to erosion, and estates that struggled to remain profitable against Brazilian and Cuban competition. Plantation ledgers from estates like Studley Park show declining yields, desperate cost-cutting measures, wage reductions, evictions from provision grounds, increased fines for freed workers who dared negotiate better terms. In 1884, tensions exploded. Workers in Roxborough and surrounding estates protested unfair taxation and government restrictions on provision grounds, small plots that freed people relied on for food security and economic independence. The protests grew into island-wide unrest, with British officials writing alarmed dispatches about rebellious conduct and combinations of laborers. Translation: Tobagonians refused to accept poverty as destiny and organized collectively to challenge it. The British response combined force and administrative punishment. Troops restored order. Leaders were arrested. And in 1889, London decided Tobago was too expensive to administer separately, so they federated it with Trinidad without consulting Tobagonians about the merger. Just woke up one morning under new governance, courtesy of imperial efficiency. This merger would shape Tobago's future for over a century. Its infrastructure chronically underfunded, its political voice diluted within Trinidad's larger population, its economic potential subordinated to Port of Spain's priorities. Tobago's story is one of endurance through every colonial shuffle, every economic crash, every administrative reorganization designed in distant offices by people who'd never felt Tobago's red soil under their feet. After decades of plantation dominance, Trinidad's economy started mutating in the late 1800s. Cocoa boomed, briefly making Trinidad one of the world's largest producers. Sugar slumped against Brazilian competition. And in the early 1900s, oil seeped to the surface near La Brea and Forest Reserve, catching the attention of British investors who were always ready to drill something profitable. The Pitch Lake, a natural asphalt deposit, had been known for centuries, but now industrial extraction began in earnest. The new oil fields brought new labor demands, and African and Indian workers, descendants of formerly enslaved people and indentured migrants, found themselves in dangerous jobs with terrible pay. Working for companies like Trinidad Leaseholds Limited, police records from the 1910s show hundreds of worker complaints. 12-hour shifts, unsafe machinery, wage theft, racist supervisors who reserved skilled positions for white workers while relegating locals to grunt work. Capitalism had entered its steam and smoke era, and Trinidad was fueling the engine. Urban life also changed rapidly. Port of Spain's barrack yards became hubs of music, argument, politics, and rumor. People debated news from India's independence struggle, Black nationalism from Marcus Garvey in the United States, labor organizing from Jamaica. The world was globalizing through newspapers, steamships, and migrant workers returning with new ideas, and Trinidad was plugged directly into these currents. The colonial government, as usual, misunderstood everything. A 1919 report warned that workers gather too frequently for discussion, which is bureaucratic code for people are developing political consciousness, and we are nervous about where this leads. Officials fretted about combinations and agitators, failing to grasp that terrible working conditions naturally produce organized resistance. You don't need outside agitators when the inside situation is sufficient agitation all by itself. Resistance was shifting from machetes and mountain hideouts to meetings, unions, and mass movement, from survival tactics to political strategy. By the 1930s, Trinidad's oil and sugar workers had enough. Poverty, stagnant wages, and racialized management created a pressure cooker, and Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler, a Grenada-born oil worker with a Pentecostal preacher's fire and a revolutionary's clarity, struck the match. Butler had worked the oil fields himself, knew the exploitation firsthand, and possessed the rare combination of charisma and fearlessness needed to confront colonial power directly. On June 19, 1937, Butler climbed onto an oil drum at Faizabad and addressed workers protesting wage cuts and dismissals. His speech electrified them. His words cutting through years of deference and fear. Police tried to arrest him mid-meeting. Workers resisted. The confrontation sparked what became known as the 1937 oil field riots, though uprising might be more accurate than riot, since riots imply chaos, while this was organized resistance. Strikes spread from Faizabad to Pointe-à-Pierre refineries and into Port of Spain. Workers shut down production across multiple estates and industrial sites. Colonial officials panicked, declaring a state of emergency. Troops were deployed. Shots were fired. Workers died, including Corporal Charles King, shot while trying to maintain order. Butler went into hiding, moving between safe houses as police searched for him. He was eventually arrested, but the movement he inspired reshaped Caribbean labor history. The British Crown, unable to ignore the scale of unrest, ordered an inquiry. The resulting Oil Field Riots Commission report accidentally admitted uncomfortable truths. Systematic exploitation, wage inequality, abysmal living conditions, and colonial neglect had ignited the protests. Recommendations included better wages, housing improvements, and labor protections, reforms that should have existed decades earlier. From the ashes of 1937 rose new leaders and institutions. Adrian Cola Rienzi organizing unions, Elma Francois building socialist movements, and the slow formation of political parties that would eventually challenge colonial rule itself. Trinidad and Tobago's march toward self-government had begun, not from parliament buildings or governor's mansions, but from the oil fields, cane fields, and barrack yards, where working people decided they deserved better. World War II rewired Trinidad and Tobago faster than any previous century of colonial slow-motion decision-making. When Britain got desperate for warships to counter German U-boats, Winston Churchill traded Caribbean land rights to the United States in the 1941 Destroyers for Bases Agreement. meaning the Americans basically arrived like a loud new neighbor with construction equipment, unlimited budgets, and very different ideas about infrastructure investment. Suddenly, thousands of American officers and engineers descended on Chaguaramas and Wallerfield, building airfields, barracks, radio towers, paved roads, electrical grids, the kind of infrastructure Britain never invested in because it didn't directly produce sugar or shareholder profits. US dollars poured into local wages, creating jobs for Trinidadians who had grown up under colonial austerity. Construction workers, cooks, cleaners, mechanics. People earned wages that actually purchased goods, a novel experience after generations of near subsistence. This shifted everything. Workers gained new bargaining power as labor demand exceeded supply. Trinidadians interacted daily with African American soldiers who were themselves resisting Jim Crow ideology abroad, sharing stories and strategies. Local politicians like Albert Gomes, representing Port of Spain, began pushing harder for constitutional reform, arguing that a population contributing to the war effort deserved political representation. Meanwhile, U.S. commanders wrote reports fretting that local people show heightened expectations for services and governance. Translation: exposure to working electricity, paved roads, and basic infrastructural respect made Trinidadians question why the British Empire wasn't delivering those things after centuries of colonial rule. Once you've seen what functional governance looks like, it's hard to accept excuses about why your own government can't provide it. The war didn't liberate the islands. American presence brought its own problems, including racial segregation on bases and tensions with local populations. But it cracked the colonial illusion of British invincibility empire, suddenly looked less like destiny and more like a choice that could be unmade. Constitutional change was coming, and Trinidadians were done waiting for permission. Post-war Trinidad was electric with possibility. Labor unions expanded membership and influence. Newspapers multiplied. Printing competing visions of the future, political debates spilled from meeting halls into street corners and panyards. And then, in 1955, a historian stepped onto the political stage with doctorate-level receipts and an orator's stamina. Dr. Eric Williams, fresh from academic battles in the United States, where racism had blocked his university career despite his brilliance. Williams returned to Trinidad and started holding outdoor lectures at Woodford Square in Port of Spain, which the public quickly renamed the University of Woodford Square. He used megaphone scholarship, explaining capitalism, colonialism, and Caribbean history, with the energy of someone who knew exactly what the archives said and was ready to expose every contradiction. His lectures dissected British colonial policy, traced the economics of slavery, and argued that Caribbean people were capable of governing themselves. Radical claims in a colony still administered from London. In 1956, Williams founded the People's National Movement, campaigning on self-government, expanded education, and dignity. The electorate responded like a suppressed story finally getting airtime. The PNM won decisively. By 1958, Trinidad and Tobago joined the West Indies Federation, a bold but troubled attempt at regional unity that collapsed by 1962 due to economic disagreements and competing national interests. Williams pushed for full internal self-government, expanding schools, supporting oil industry development, and challenging British paternalism at every bureaucratic turn. When the Federation failed, Trinidad and Tobago negotiated independence separately. On August 31, 1962, at midnight, the Union Jack came down for the last time, and the new national flag rose, red, white, and black, colors chosen to symbolize the nation's vitality, the surrounding sea, and the people's dedication. Independence wasn't a gift from empire. It was the consequence of centuries of refusal to accept subjugation as permanent. Independence launched Trinidad and Tobago into the deep end of nationhood. Economic planning, ethnic politics, oil booms, steel pan innovation, and the lingering colonial habit of underfunding Tobago. The 1960s and early 1970s were loud. Literally, with pan pioneers building orchestras from discarded oil drums, turning emblems of industrial waste into instruments of global musical brilliance. Steel pan became national culture, proof that creativity flourishes even in, or perhaps because of, constraint. Economically, oil surged during the 1970s price shocks, briefly making Trinidad and Tobago wealthy by regional standards. The Point Lisas industrial estate emerged, processing petrochemicals and creating manufacturing jobs. But political tensions simmered beneath the boom. Ethnic divisions between African and Indian communities, class struggles, unemployment despite oil wealth, and the persistent question of Tobago's autonomy. Tobagonians, long sidelined since the 1889 merger, pushed back through organized advocacy. Leaders like A.N.R. Robinson argued that the forced union had produced structurally unequal development. Trinidad received infrastructure investment, while Tobago's roads, schools, and hospitals languished. The seeds of the future Tobago House of Assembly were planted in protest meetings, petitions, and the slow realization that autonomy required institutional power. Meanwhile, the young nation continued shedding colonial structures. In 1976, Trinidad and Tobago became a republic, replacing the British monarch with a local president. The Constitution enshrined rights shaped not by Westminster tradition, but by lived Caribbean experience, protections against discrimination, commitments to education and healthcare, recognition of cultural diversity. The Republic Act closed a political circle stretching back centuries, from indigenous autonomy to colonial domination, to emancipation, to self-government, to statehood, to republic. Each transition built on resistance and negotiation, on people refusing to accept subordination as natural or permanent. Freedom is never a single moment. It's an ongoing negotiation between past wounds and future hopes, between what was survived and what might yet be built. At dusk, the camera rises over the northern range one final time, clouds settling between ridges that once hid indigenous fighters, Maroons, escaped laborers, oil field marchers, and independence activists. The light hits the hillside in a way that feels ancient, like memory, not scenery. You hear faint steel pan notes drifting from a village below, rhythms layered with ancestral echoes that crossed oceans unwillingly somewhere in Tobago. Waves crash against coves where Africans once strategized freedom and farmers defended their provision grounds. The land is quiet, but it's not silent. Every valley holds a story, the textbooks condensed into footnotes. Every river remembers names the archives forgot to record. Every movement toward justice echoes footsteps centuries old. Indigenous people who refused missions, Africans who chose mountains over submission, workers who built unions in oil fields, students who demanded sovereignty. Trinidad and Tobago is not the sum of conquests. It is the sum of resistances, small and large, violent and patient, individual and collective. The islands didn't become independent because empires grew generous. They became independent because people here never stopped insisting on their own humanity, their right to determine their own futures. If you stand on a ridge overlooking Port of Spain or Scarborough at twilight and listen long enough, you'll feel it. That steady, stubborn heartbeat running through the islands like an underground river. It's the sound of survival strategies passed down through generations, of cultures adapting without disappearing, of communities rebuilding after every disaster. History didn't just happen here. History fought here. And the fight didn't end with independence. It transformed into new struggles over equity, development, identity, and belonging the mountains still remember. The archives are incomplete, but memory persists in music, in food, in the way people speak and gather and resist. The story continues, unfinished, carried forward by everyone who refuses to let the past be forgotten or the future be predetermined.